Picture this: a Texas correctional officer and his beautiful fiancée, ready to say, "I do," on the happiest day of their lives. But before the vows are spoken, two women from his past, his exes, both felons with score to settle, turn their wedding into a nightmare. Love, jealousy, and revenge collide in a shocking double murder that no one saw coming. It was supposed to be a perfect day in Texas. James Carter, a hard-working correctional officer, stood at the altar waiting to marry the love of his life, Emily Hayes. The chapel was filled with friends and family, the air buzzing with excitement. But just hours before the cake was cut, tragedy struck. Two women, Tamika Jones and Lisa Ray, both convicted felons and mothers of James's children, crashed the celebration with a deadly plan. Fueled by years of bitterness and desperation, they didn't just want to ruin the wedding. They wanted James and Emily gone for good. This is a chilling true crime story of a wedding day turned into a bloodbath, a tale of love torn apart by hate. James Carter woke up on the morning of his wedding day with a big smile on his face. It was June 15th, 2024, and the sun was shining bright over the small town of Willow Creek, Texas. At 34 years old, James felt like his life was finally coming together. He had a steady job as a correctional officer at the nearby Huntsville prison, a beautiful fiancée named Emily Hayes, and a little house they'd bought together just outside town. Today was the day he'd make Emily his wife, and nothing could ruin that. Not the long shift at the prison, not the stress of planning a wedding, and not even the messy past he'd worked so hard to leave behind. James rolled out of bed in the guest room of his buddy Mike's house. Tradition said the groom couldn't see the bride before the wedding, so he'd spent the night there. He stretched his arms, his muscles sore from a week of double shifts at the prison, and looked at himself in the mirror. His short black hair was neat, his brown eyes bright with excitement. He was a big guy, 6 feet tall and strong from years of handling rowdy inmates. But today, he wasn't a tough prison guard. He was just a man in love. Downstairs, Mike was already flipping pancakes in the kitchen. "You ready to tie the knot, man?" Mike asked with a grin, sliding a plate toward James. "More than ready," James said, pouring syrup over the stack. "Emily is the best thing that ever happened to me. Today is going to be perfect." Mike nodded. "You deserve it, bro. After all the crap you've been through, it's about time you got a win." James smiled, but his mind drifted for a second. Mike was right. He'd been through a lot. Growing up in a rough part of Houston, James had made some bad choices as a teenager. He'd run with the wrong crowd, gotten into fights, even spent a night or two in juvie. But at 20, he turned it around. He got his GED, took a job at the prison, and swore he'd build a better life. That's when he met Tamika Jones and Lisa Ray, two women who nearly derailed everything. They were part of his past, and he'd fought hard to keep them there. Tamika was his first serious girlfriend. They met when he was 22, just starting out as a guard. She was loud, wild, and full of energy, everything James thought he wanted back then. They had a son together, Jamal, who was now 11. But Tamika had a dark side. She got hooked on drugs, started stealing to pay for them, and ended up in prison for armed robbery when Jamal was just a baby. James got full custody and cut her out of his life. She'd been paroled a year ago, but he hadn't seen her since. Lisa came a few years later, when James was 26. She was quieter than Tamika, but just as troubled. They had a daughter, Kaylee, now 7. Lisa was smart, too smart. Sometimes she'd talk her way out of anything, but she couldn't talk her way out of a drug trafficking charge that landed her behind bars. James had custody of Kaylee too, and Lisa hadn't been around since her release 6 months back. Both women were felons, both had kids with him, and both hated him for moving on. But James didn't want to think about them today. He shook off the memories and finished his breakfast. "Gotta get to the chapel," he said, clapping Mike on the shoulder. "See you there." Across town, Emily Hayes was getting ready too. She stood in her mom's living room, staring at herself in a full-length mirror. Her white dress hugged her slim frame, the lace sleeves delicate against her pale skin. Her blonde hair was pinned up in soft curls, and her green eyes sparkled with nervous excitement. At 29, Emily was the kind of woman everyone loved, sweet, hardworking, and always smiling. She'd grown up in Willow Creek, taught 3rd grade at the local elementary school, and never thought she'd fall for a guy like James. They'd met 2 years ago at a barbecue. Emily was there with friends. James was grilling burgers with Mike. She liked his laugh, deep and warm, and the way he looked at her like she was the only person in the room. He told her about his job, his kids, and his past, holding nothing back. Emily didn't care about the mistakes he'd made. She saw the man he'd become, and that was enough. Now, As her mom zipped up her dress, Emily felt a flutter in her chest. "Mom, do you think he's nervous?" she asked. Her mom, Linda, laughed. "If he's not, he's crazy. Every groom's nervous on his wedding day. But James loves you, honey. You'll see it in his eyes when you walk down that aisle." Emily smiled. The ceremony was set for 3 p.m. at Willow Creek Chapel, a little white building with stained glass windows and a big oak tree out front. They'd invited 50 people, family, friends, and a few co-workers from the prison and the school. Jamal and Kaylee would be there too, carrying the rings. It wasn't a fancy wedding, but it was theirs, and that's what mattered. While James and Emily prepared for their big day, 2 other women were making plans of their own. Tamika Jones sat in a rundown apartment 20 miles away in Huntsville, chain-smoking cigarettes. She was 33, with sharp cheekbones and tired eyes that had seen too much. Her dark hair was pulled back tight, and her hand shook a little as she tapped ash into a cracked mug. Across from her sat Lisa Ray, 31. Her thin frame hunched over a table covered in empty beer cans. Lisa's brown hair hung limp around her face, and her cold blue eyes stared at a photo of James and Emily torn from a local newspaper. "He thinks he can just start over," Tamika muttered, her voice rough. "Like we don't exist. Like Jamal don't matter." Lisa snorted. "Kaylee neither. He took our kids," Tamika. "Took him?" "And gave him to that prissy little teacher. Now they're playing happy family." Tamika crushed her cigarette into the mug. "I saw him last week, you know? Dropping Jamal off at school. Didn't even look my way. Acting like I'm invisible." Lisa leaned back, crossing her arms. "He's got some nerve marrying her today. After everything he put us through." The 2 women had met in prison years ago, bonded over their shared anger at James. Tamika blamed him for not bailing her out when she got arrested. Said he abandoned her. Lisa was convinced he'd set her up, tipped off the cops about her drug deals to get her out of the picture. Neither story was true, but they believed it with every fiber of their being. When they heard about the wedding through a mutual friend, something snapped. They weren't going to let James have his happy ending. "I say we crash it," Tamika said, her voice low. "Show up and remind him who he's dealing with." Lisa's lips curled into a smirk. "Oh, we'll do more than that. He don't get to walk away clean. Neither does she." They spent the next hour plotting. Tamika had a gun, an old pistol she'd gotten from a guy she knew in Huntsville. Lisa had a knife, sharp and easy to hide. They'd drive to Willow Creek, wait for the right moment, and make James pay. It wasn't just about revenge, it was about pride. He'd taken their kids, their lives, their futures. Now they'd take his. Back in Willow Creek, the chapel was coming to life. Guests trickled in, chatting and laughing as they took their seats. James stood at the altar in his black tux, adjusting his tie. Jamal and Kaylee fidgeted nearby, proud of their ring-bearer roles. The organ started playing softly, and James took a deep breath. Any minute now, Emily would walk through those doors, and his new life would begin. He had no idea what was coming. No one did. The clock in the Willow Creek Chapel ticked closer to 3 p.m., and the air inside buzzed with excitement. James Carter stood at the altar, his hands clasped in front of him. He could feel the sweat on his palms, but he didn't care. All he could think about was Emily, how she'd look in her dress, how her smile would light up the room. The pews were filling up with familiar faces. His co-workers from prison in their Sunday best, Emily's teacher friends whispering about how cute the kids looked, and his mom, sitting in the front row with tears already in her eyes. Jamal and Kaylee stood beside him, squirming a little but proud to be part of the day. Everything felt right. Outside, the big oak tree swayed in a warm breeze, and the parking lot was packed with cars adorned with ribbons and just married signs. No one noticed the beat-up gray sedan that pulled in slow and parked at the far end, half hidden behind a pickup truck. Inside that car, Tamika Jones gripped the steering wheel tight, her knuckles white. Lisa Ray sat in the passenger seat, her knife tucked into the waistband of her jeans, a baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. "You sure about this?" Tamika asked, her voice shaky but sharp. She lit another cigarette, the smoke curling up against the cracked windshield. Lisa didn't look at her. She just stared at the chapel doors, her jaw tight. "We're past sure, Tamika. He don't get to do this to us. Not after everything." Tamika nodded slow, blowing smoke out the window. She reached under her seat and pulled out the pistol, a rusty .38 she bought off a guy named Rico for $50. It wasn't much, but it worked. She'd tested it in the woods a week ago, firing in an old beer can. The kick had surprised her, but the hole in the can told her it'd do the job. She slid it into her jacket pocket, the weight of it heavy against her chest. Their plan was simple but messy. They'd wait until the ceremony started. When everyone was focused on James and Emily, Tamika would go in first, act like she was just there to see her son, Jamal. Lisa would hang back, slip in through a side door she'd scoped out earlier that week when she'd driven by the chapel pretending to be lost. They'd catch James off guard. Tamika with the gun, Lisa with a knife. Emily was collateral damage, a bonus in their eyes. They didn't care who saw. They'd be in and out before anyone could stop them. "We hit him quick," Lisa said, her voice low and steady. "No talking, no yelling, just do it and go." Tamika flicked her cigarette, but out the window. "What about the kids?" Lisa's eyes flickered for a second, but her face stayed hard. "They'll be fine. They're ours, not hers. We're taking them back." It wasn't true. They had no real plan for Jamal and Kaylee after this, but it made them feel better, like they weren't just monsters. Deep down, they knew the kids wouldn't go with them willingly, not after years of James raising them right. But anger had a way of twisting the truth, and right now, it was all they had to hold on to. Inside the chapel, the organ swelled into the first notes of "Here Comes the Bride." James straightened up, his heart pounding. The double doors of the back swung open, and there she was, Emily, glowing in her white dress, her arm looped through her dad's. The crowd let out a soft ooh, and James felt his throat tighten. She was beautiful, more than he'd ever dreamed. Her eyes locked on his, and she smiled, a little shy but full of love. He smiled back, forgetting everything else in the world. Emily's dad walked her down the aisle, slow and steady, while cameras flashed and people dabbed at their eyes. Jamal and Kaylee stood straighter, clutching the little satin pillows with rings. When Emily reached the altar, her dad kissed her cheek and stepped back. She took James's hands, and the preacher, a round-faced man named Pastor Dan, cleared his throat. "Dearly beloved," he began, his voice booming through the small chapel. "We are gathered here today to join James Carter and Emily Hayes in holy matrimony." Outside, Tamika and Lisa watched the sedan's dirty windows. They could hear the faint music, see the shadows moving behind the stained glass windows. Tamika's stomach twisted. She'd loved James once, back when they were young and dumb. He'd promised her a future, but then he'd walked away when she messed up. She told herself this was his fault. If he'd stuck by her, she wouldn't be here now, holding a gun. Lisa's mind was colder, sharper. She didn't love James anymore. Maybe she never had. To her, he was a thief. He'd taken Kaylee, her only piece of good in a rotten life, and handed her over to Emily like Lisa didn't matter. She pictured Emily in that white dress, all perfect and happy, and her fingers tightened around the knife handle. This wasn't just about James anymore. Emily had to pay too. "Let's move," Lisa said. "Open the car door. They're distracted. It's time." Tamika took a deep breath and stepped out, the pistol heavy in her pocket. They split up, Tamika heading for the front doors, Lisa circling around to the side. The gravel crunched under their boots, but no one inside heard a thing over the preacher's voice and the soft sobs of happy guests. Back at the altar, James squeezed Emily's hands as Pastor Dan kept talking. "Marriage is a sacred bond," he said, "a promise before God and man to love and honor one another." James barely heard the words. He was lost in Emily's eyes, thinking about the life they'd built, the family vacations, the quiet nights at home, growing old together. He didn't notice the front doors creak open behind him, or the woman in a faded jacket slip inside, her face half hidden by a hood. Tamika stood at the back of the chapel, her heart racing. She saw Jamal up front, his little tux fitting him just right, and for a split second, she hesitated. He looked so happy, so much like James. But then she saw Emily, all perfect in white, and the anger roared back. She slid her hand into her pocket, fingers closing around the gun. At the same moment, Lisa found a side door, a small entrance near the choir room. It was unlocked, just like she'd hoped. She pushed it open quiet, stepping into a dark hallway that smelled like old hymnals and lemon cleaner. She could hear the ceremony through the walls, Pastor Dan's voice droning on about love and commitment. Her lips curled into a sneer. She crept forward, knife in hand, staying low. Up front, Pastor Dan smiled at the couple. "If anyone here has reason these two should not be joined, speak now or forever hold your peace." The room went quiet, just for a second. Then the front doors banged open wide, and Tamika stepped forward, her voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "Yeah, I got a reason," she shouted, pulling the gun from her pocket and pointing it straight at James. The crowd gasped, heads whipping around. James turned, his eyes wide with shock. "Tamika," he said, his voice cracking. Emily froze, her hand still in his, her face pale. "James, who?" Before she could finish, screams erupted as people ducked behind pews. Jamal and Kaylee dropped their ring pillows, staring at Tamika in confusion. "Mom," Jamal whispered. Tamika's hand shook, but her eyes burned with fury. "You don't get to do this, James. You don't get to forget me." From the side, Lisa burst out the hallway, knife gleaming in her hand. She didn't say a word, just charged straight for Emily, her face twisted with hate. The chapel exploded into chaos. James shoved Emily behind him, his prison guard instincts kicking in. "Get back!" he yelled, but was too late. Tamika pulled the trigger, and a gunshot cracked through the air, loud and final. The gunshot echoed through Willow Creek Chapel, a sound so loud it seemed to shake the stained glass windows. For a split second, time stopped. The guests froze mid-scream, their faces twisted in panic. James Carter felt the air rush past his ear as the bullet missed him by inches, slamming into the wooden cross behind the altar. Splinters flew, and Emily let out a sharp cry, clinging to his arm. He turned to shield her, his heart pounding like a drum. But before he could move, Lisa Ray was on them. Lisa lunged at Emily with a knife, her eyes wild and her arms swinging fast. James reacted on instinct, shoving Emily out of the way. The blade caught his shoulder instead, slicing through his tuxedo and into his skin. He grunted in pain, stumbling back, blood soaking the white shirt beneath his jacket. Emily hit the floor hard, her dress tangling around her legs, her veil tumbling off. "James!" she screamed, scrambling to her knees. Lisa didn't stop. She raised the knife again, ready to strike, but James grabbed her wrist with his good hand, twisting it hard. He'd dealt with inmates trying to shank him before. This was no different. "Lisa, stop it!" he yelled, his voice rough with pain and anger. They struggled, her thin frame surprisingly strong, fueled by years of pent-up rage. At the back of the chapel, Tamika Jones stood with the pistol still raised, her hands trembling. She hadn't meant to miss. She'd aimed for James's chest, but the gun was old, the sights off, and her nerves were shot. Now she saw Jamal staring at her, his little face pale with fear, and something twisted in her gut. "Jamal, baby, get over here," she shouted, but he didn't move. He just backed up toward Kaylee, who was crying and clutching the edge of the altar. The guests were in chaos. Some bolted for the doors, tripping over pews. Others huddled low, sobbing and praying. Mike, James's best man, jumped up from his spot near the front and tackled Tamika from the side, slamming her into the wall. The gun clattered to the floor, spinning across the hardwood. "Stay down," Mike roared, pinning her arms as she thrashed and cursed. "Get off me," Tamika shrieked, kicking at him. "He deserves it. He took everything from me." Up front, James and Lisa were still locked in a fight. Blood dripped down his arm, staining Emily's dress where she crawled back to him. "Lisa, please," Emily begged, tears streaming down her face. "We don't want to hurt you." Lisa laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "Too late for that, princess." She yanked her arm free from James's grip and swung the knife again, this time at Emily. James threw himself in front of her, taking the hit to his side. The blade sank deep, and he gasped, dropping to one knee. "James, no!" Emily cried, grabbing his shoulders as he slumped forward. Blood pooled on the floor, dark and spreading fast. She pressed her hands against the wound, trying to stop it, but it was too much. Her white dress turned red, the lace soaking through. Lisa stepped back, breathing hard, the knife slick in her hand. She looked at James, crumpled and bleeding, and then at Emily, sobbing over him. For a second, her face softened, like maybe she realized what she'd done. But then, Tamika's voice snapped her out of it. "Lisa, let's go." Tamika yelled, still wrestling with Mike. She'd managed to elbow him in the face, and he loosened his grip just enough for her to break free. She scooped up the gun and fired again, wild this time, the bullet smashing into a pew and sending with chips flying. The second shot jolted everyone into action. Pastor Dan, who'd been hiding behind the pulpit, grabbed Jamal and Kaylee and pulled them toward the choir room door. "Come on, kids, this way," he said, his voice shaking but firm. They ran with him, disappearing into the hallway where Lisa had come from. Emily looked up from James, her hands slippery with his blood. "Help him," she screamed at the crowd. "Somebody, please." A few guests snapped out of their shock. One of Emily's teacher friends, Sarah, yanked out her phone and dialed 911, her fingers fumbling. Yes, hello. There's a shooting at Willow Creek Chapel. People are hurt. Please hurry, she said, her voice breaking. James's co-worker from the prison, a burly guy named Tony, rushed the altar. He grabbed Lisa from behind, locking her arms in a bear hug. Drop it, he bellowed, squeezing until the knife fell from her hand and clattered to the floor. She kicked and swore, but Tony was twice her size and held her tight. Tamika saw Lisa get caught and hesitated. She still had the gun, but Mike was back on his feet, blood trickling from his nose and coming for her again. The chapel doors burst open as a few guests who'd escaped ran back in with the deputy sheriff. Willow Creek's only cop on duty that afternoon. He'd been patrolling nearby and heard the shots. "Drop the weapon," the deputy shouted, his own gun drawn and pointed at Tamika. She froze, her eyes darting from the deputy to James bleeding on the altar, to Emily crying over him, to Lisa pinned by Tony. It was over. She'd lost control. Slowly, she let the pistol slip from her fingers and raised her hands. "Don't shoot," she muttered, her voice hollow. Mike tackled her again anyway, shoving her face down onto the floor. The deputy rushed over, cuffs out, and snapped them onto her wrists. "You're under arrest," he said, his voice steady but loud over chaos. Tony dragged Lisa toward the deputy, who cuffed her too. She didn't fight anymore, just glared at Emily with pure hate as she was pulled away. The chapel was a mess. Overturned pews, shattered glass, and blood staining the altar where James lay. Emily cradled James's head in her lap, her hands shaking as she pressed his wound. "Stay with me, James, please," she whispered. His eyes fluttered, his breathing shallow. "I love you. Don't leave me." He tried to speak, but only a weak groan came out. His face was pale, his strength fading fast. Tony knelt beside them, ripping off his tie to make a makeshift bandage. "Hang on, man," he said. "Help's coming." Sirens wailed in the distance, getting closer. The deputy barked orders into his radio, calling for backup and an ambulance. Guests milled around, some crying, some trying to help, others just staring in shock. Sarah ran to Emily, wrapping an arm around her shoulders. "The paramedics are almost here," she said softly. "He's going to be okay." But Emily wasn't sure. The blood kept coming, and James's eyes were closing. She held him tighter, praying harder than she ever had in her life. Outside, the gray sedan sat quiet in the parking lot, a silent witness to the nightmare unfolding. Tamika and Lisa were shoved into the back of the deputy's cruiser, their hands cuffed, their faces blank. They didn't look at each other. Whatever bond they'd had was gone, drowned in the mess they'd made. The ambulance screeched into the lot, lights flashing red and blue. Paramedics jumped out, rushing inside with a stretcher and a medical bag. They pushed the crowd to the altar, where James lay still, Emily sobbing over him. "Ma'am, we need you to step back," one of them said, gentle but firm. She didn't want to let go, but Sarah pulled her away. The paramedics worked fast, cutting open James's shirt, slapping pad on his chest, shouting things like "pulse weak" and "get the 4 in." They lifted him onto the stretcher, blood dripping onto the floor, and wheeled him out to the ambulance. Emily followed, her dress ruined, her face streaked with tears. "I'm going with him," she said, climbing in behind them. The doors slammed shut, and the ambulance tore off toward Huntsville General Hospital. Sirens blaring. Back in the chapel, the deputy secured the scene as more police arrived. Pastor Dan came out of the choir room with Jamal and Kaylee, both kids shaking and clinging to him. "They're safe," he told the officers. But they saw everything. The crowd thinned as people were sent home or questioned outside. The altar sat empty now. The cross splintered, the floor stained red. What should have been a day of joy was a crime scene, and no one knew if James would survive the night. The ambulance sped down the highway toward Huntsville General Hospital, its sirens cutting through the quiet Texas afternoon. Inside, Emily Hayes sat hunched on a narrow bench, her blood-stained wedding dress clinging to her legs. She stared at James Carter, lying on the stretcher as paramedics worked over him. His tuxedo was shredded, his chest bare where they cut it open to press bandages against a knife wound in his side. Tubes snaked from his arm to an N4 bag, and a mask pumped oxygen into his pale face. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow and uneven. "Stay with me, James," Emily whispered, her voice trembling. She reached out to touch his hand, but a paramedic, a young woman with a tight ponytail, gently pushed her back. "Ma'am, we need space," the paramedic said, her tone calm but firm. She pressed a fresh gauze pad against James's side, where blood still seeped out despite their efforts. His pressure's dropping. We're almost there." Emily nodded, biting her lip to keep from crying again. Her hand shook, smeared with James's blood, and her mind raced. Just hours ago, they'd been laughing over breakfast plans, dreaming about their honeymoon in Galveston. Now she didn't know if he'd make it through the day. The image of Tamika with the gun and Lisa with the knife flashed in her head, and a hot wave of anger mixed with her fear. Why had they done this? What kind of hate could turn a wedding into a slaughter? The ambulance jolted as it pulled into the hospital's emergency bay. Doors flew open and a team of nurses and doctors rushed out, shouting orders. Male 34, stab wound to the abdomen, gunshot missed, lost a lot of blood. The paramedic yelled as they wheeled James inside. Emily stumbled out behind them, her legs weak, and followed the stretcher through the sliding glass doors. The ER was a blur of white coats and beeping machines. They pushed James straight into a trauma room, curtains snapping shut behind him. A nurse grabbed Emily's arm. "You need to wait here," she said, pointing to a row of plastic chairs in the waiting area. "We'll let you know as soon as we can." "No, I need to be with him," Emily protested, her voice breaking. "I'm sorry, ma'am," the nurse said, softer this time. "They're doing everything they can. Sit down, please." Emily sank into a chair, her dress crinkling around her. She buried her face in her hands, the tears coming hard now. The waiting room smelled like antiseptic and coffee, and the TV in the corner droned with a weather report no one cared about. She felt alone, even as more people trickled in. Her mom, Linda, her friend Sarah, and James's buddy Mike, his nose still bruised from tackling Tamika. Linda wrapped her arms around Emily, pulling her close. "Oh, honey," she said, her voice thick with worry. "He's strong. He'll pull through." Mike paced nearby, his fists clenched. "Those two, they're animals. I should have seen it coming. James told me they were trouble, but I didn't think they'd do this." Sarah sat beside Emily, rubbing her back. "The police have them now. They can't hurt anyone else." Emily nodded, but the words didn't sink in. All she could see was James's blood on her hands, his eyes fluttering shut. She prayed silently, over and over, begging God to save him. Inside the trauma room, the doctors fought to do just that. James's vitals were crashing, his heart rate too slow, his blood pressure sinking. "He's in hypovolemic shock," the lead surgeon, Dr. Patel, said, his gloved hands moving fast. Knife hit the spleen. "We need to get him to the or now." They stabilized him as best they could, more four fluids, a blood transfusion, and rushed him upstairs to surgery. The operating room was cold and bright. The team scrubbed in and ready. Dr. Patel cut into James's abdomen, working to repair the torn spleen and stop the internal bleeding. "He's lost too much blood," he muttered. "If we don't move fast, we'll lose him." Back in Willow Creek, the chapel was now a full-blown crime scene. Yellow tape stretched across the doors, and police cars lined the parking lot, their lights flashing in the fading afternoon sun. Sheriff's deputies from Huntsville had arrived to help the lone Willow Creek deputy, and they swarmed the place, taking photos, bagging evidence, and interviewing witnesses. Tamika Jones and Lisa Ray sat in separate holding cells at the county jail, cuffed and silent. Tamika stared at the wall, her mind replaying the moment she'd pulled the trigger. She hadn't wanted it to go this far. Not really. She just wanted James to hurt, to feel the pain she carried for years. But seeing Jamal's scared face, hearing Kaylee cry, it hit her hard. What had she done? Lisa, in the next cell, didn't feel the same regret. She leaned against a concrete wall, her arms crossed, replaying the knife sinking into James. She wanted Emily too, but James had gotten in the way. She didn't care if he lived or died. She just wished he'd finish the job. Her hate was a cold, hard thing, and nothing would change it. Detective Maria Salazar, a no-nonsense woman with 15 years on the force, took charge of the case. She stood in the chapel, her boots crunching on broken glass, and surveyed the mess. The gun was bagged, the knife too, both smeared with fingerprints. Blood stained the altar, and the splintered cross hung crooked above it. She'd seen a lot in her career, but this, a wedding turned into a bloodbath, was new. "All right," she said to her team. "What V we got?" A deputy handed her a notebook. 2 suspects, Tamika Jones and Lisa Ray. Both felons, both exes of the victim, James Carter. Witnesses say Jones fired the gun, missed him. Ray stabbed him twice. Looks like Carter's fiancée, Emily Hayes, wasn't hit. Kids, Carter's son and daughter, saw it go down but weren't hurt. Salazar nodded, flipping through the notes. Motive? Jealousy, revenge. The deputy said, "Carter's got custody of their kids. Jones and Ray both did time. Got out recently. Word is they blamed him for their problems." She tapped her pen against her chin. "And the kids?" "With the pastor now," he said. "Shaken up, but safe. Family's on the way to get them." Salazar walked to the altar, crouching to study the bloodstains. This wasn't random. They planned it. "Check that sedan in the lot. Bet it's theirs. I want tire tracks, prints, everything." Her team spread out, dusting for prints and collecting shell casings. The deputy who'd arrested Tamika and Lisa approached. "They're not talking yet," he said. Jones looks rattled. "Ray's just cold." "They'll talk," Salazar said, standing up. "Give him a night in a cell. We've got enough to hold them. Attempted murder for now. If Carter doesn't make it, it's murder one." At the hospital, hours crawled by. Emily sat in the waiting room, her mom and friends around her, a blanket draped over her shoulders because she couldn't stop shivering. Finally, Dr. Patel came out, his scrub stained with sweat. Emily jumped up, her heart in her throat. "He's out of surgery," the doctor said. "We repaired the spleen and stopped the bleeding, but he's not out of danger. He lost a lot of blood, and there's risk of infection. He's in ICU now, critical but stable." Emily let out a sob, half relief, half fear. "Can I see him?" "Soon," Dr. Patel said. "He's sedated. Give us an hour to get him settled." She nodded, sinking back into her chair. Stable was better than dead, but critical still scared her. She clung to hope, picturing James waking up, smiling at her again. Outside, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows over Huntsville. The chapel sat quiet, a grim reminder of the day's horror. Jamal and Kaylee were picked up by James's mom, who hugged him tight and promised they'd see their dad soon. The police worked late, piecing together evidence, while Tamika and Lisa stewed in their cells, the weight of their choices sinking in. For Emily, every minute felt like a lifetime, waiting to see if the man she loved would live to be her husband, or if their wedding day would be his last. The intensive care unit at Huntsville General Hospital hummed with the soft beeps of machines, keeping James Carter alive. It was just past midnight on June 16th, 2024, and Emily Hayes sat beside his bed, her hand gripping his. His face was pale, almost gray, under the oxygen mask. Tubes ran from his arm to enfour drip, and bandages covered the stab wounds in his shoulder and side. Blood still seeped through the gauze, a dark stain spreading slow. Emily's wedding dress was gone, swapped for a hospital blanket wrapped around her shoulders, but her hands were still sticky with his blood. "James, please," she whispered, her voice shaking. "You can't leave me. Not today." Her green eyes were red and swollen, tears cutting tracks down her cheeks. She'd been praying nonstop, begging him to wake up, to fight. The doctor had said critical but stable hours ago, but that felt like a lie now. Every beep of the monitor sounded weaker. A nurse stepped in, her face tight with worry. "Ma'am." His pressure's dropping again, she said, checking the screens. "I'm getting the doctor." She hurried out, leaving Emily alone with the machines and her fear. James's hand twitched in hers, and his eyes fluttered open for a moment. "Em," he rasped, barely audible through the mask. "I'm here," she said, leaning closer. "I'm right here, James." He tried to say more, but a cough rattled his chest, and blood flecked his lips. His eyes closed again, and the monitor screamed, a flat, piercing tone that froze Emily's heart. "No, no, no," she cried, shaking his arm. "James, stay with me." The door burst open, and Dr. Patel rushed in with two nurses. "Code blue," he shouted, pushing Emily back. They ripped the blanket off James, started chest compressions, and shoved a tube down his throat. Emily stumbled into the wall, her hands over her mouth, watching as they fought to bring him back. The defibrillator whined, and his body jerked with each shock, but the line stayed flat. "Time of death, 12:47 a.m., Dr. Patel said finally, his voice heavy. He pulled off his gloves and turned to Emily. "I'm so sorry. The bleeding, we couldn't stop it." His spleen ruptured again. Emily didn't hear him. She sank to the floor, a wail tearing out of her. "No, he can't, please, no." The nurses tried to help her up, but she pushed them away, crawling to James's side. She grabbed his hand, still warm, and pressed it to her face. "You promised me," she sobbed. "You promised forever." The hospital staff stood back, giving her space. Her mom, Linda, arrived minutes later, alerted by a nurse's call. She found Emily crumpled beside the bed, rocking back and forth, and pulled her into a hug. "Oh, honey," Linda whispered, crying too. "I'm here. I've got you." But Emily didn't feel her mom's arms. She didn't feel anything, just a cold, empty hole where her heart used to be. James was gone, her groom stolen on their wedding day. She stayed there, staring at his still face, until exhaustion took over and Linda coaxed her to a chair in the waiting room. At the county jail, Detective Maria Salazar was wrapping up her first round with Tamika Jones. It was 2 a.m., and Tamika sat slumped in the interrogation room, her wrists cuffed, her eyes hollow. Salazar had just gotten off the phone with the hospital. She sat down, her face grim. "James Carter's dead," she said flat. "Died an hour ago. That makes this murder. Tamika, you and Lisa, you killed him." Tamika's head snapped up, her breath catching. "He's dead." Her voice was small, like she didn't believe it. She wanted him to hurt, sure, but dead? Her hands shook and tears spilled over. I just wanted him to see me." Salazar leaned in. "You shot at him. Lisa stabbed him. He's gone, and you're both on the hook. Tell me everything. Maybe the day cuts you a break." Tamika broke then, sobbing as she spilled it all. The plan to crash the wedding, the gun she bought, Lisa's push to make it bloody. "I didn't think he'd die," she choked out. "I saw Jamal there, and I messed up so bad." In the next room, Lisa Ray smirked when Detective Harris gave her the news. "Good," she said, her voice ice. "He had it coming. Took my Kaylee, gave her to that woman." Harris stared at her. "You proud of this? Stabbing a man on his wedding day." "Should have got her too," Lisa said, leaning back. "Emily, she don't deserve my kid neither." Harris shook his head, writing it down. "Coldest thing I've ever heard. You're done, Lisa." Back at the hospital, the sun rose over Huntsville, but it didn't reach Emily. She sat in the waiting room, numb, while Linda made calls to James's mom, Ruth, to Mike, to Sarah. Word spread fast. James was dead. The chapel attack had claimed him, and Willow Creek reeled. But the nightmare wasn't over. At 8 a.m., Emily stood in the hospital parking lot with Linda, waiting for Mike to pick them up. She was drained, her eyes blank, clutching James's wallet, the only thing she'd taken from his room. A shadow moved behind a parked car, and before anyone could react, Lisa Ray stepped out. She wasn't in jail. She'd slipped custody during a chaotic transfer when a fight broke out among other inmates. A stolen orderly uniform and a desperate sprint had gotten her here. In her hand was a scalpel, swiped from a supply cart. Her eyes locked on Emily, burning with hate. "You," Lisa hissed. "You took everything." Emily barely had time to scream. Linda shouted, "No!" and lunged, but Lisa was faster. She drove the scalpel into Emily's chest, once, twice, 3 times, quick and brutal. Emily gasped, blood blooming across her sweatshirt, and crumpled to the pavement. Linda tackled Lisa, slamming her into the car, but it was too late. Emily lay still, her eyes wide open, staring at the sky. Mike screeched into the lot just as hospital security rushed out, pinning Lisa down. She didn't fight, just laughed, a hollow, broken sound. Paramedics tried to save Emily, but the wounds were too deep, the blood too much. She was gone before they got her inside, dead at 8:14 a.m., hours after James. The double murder was complete. The aftermath was a storm. Lisa was dragged back to jail, now facing 2 murder charges. Tamika's plea deal vanished. Both women got life without parole when the trial came months later. Evidence piled high. The gun, the knife, the scalpel, witnesses from the chapel, and the parking lot. The judge called it a tragedy born of pure spite, and no one disagreed. Jamal and Kaylee went to Ruth, their grandmother, who raised them with a heavy heart. She buried James in Willow Creek Cemetery, his headstone simple. Loving father, taken too soon. Emily's family laid her beside him, her marker reading, "Beloved daughter, forever in our hearts." The kids grew up with nightmares, their parents' deaths a shadow they couldn't escape. Willow Creek rebuilt the chapel, but no one forgot. The story became legend, a warning about jealousy and revenge. Tamika sat in her cell, haunted by Jamal's face, while Lisa stared at walls, unrepentant to the end. For James and Emily, their wedding day was their last, a vow cut short by blood and hate. And that's the end of a story of love, hate, and a wedding day turned deadly. James and Emily's lives were cut short by Tamika and Lisa's jealousy and rage, leaving behind a shattered family in a town that'll never forget. It's a dark tale, but one that makes you think, what drives someone to go this far? Could anything have stopped it? Now it's your turn. What did you think of the story? Did Tamika and Lisa get what they deserved with life in prison? Or should the punishment have been different? Were you shocked by how it all played out? Or did you see the double murder coming? Maybe you've got ideas about what could have happened instead. Let me know. Drop your thoughts in the comments below. I'd love to hear your opinions. So don't be shy. Share what's on your mind.